Before the courtroom doors opened, Vivian Ashford cornered Nolan Reed in the corridor and pressed a confession agreement into his hands, telling him it was the simplest way out. Sign it, keep his freedom, avoid 10 years behind bars, and let the whole ugly matter disappear before the morning session began. The single father stood there with his daughter waiting on a bench just outside the hall, and he still refused. Vivian believed with absolute certainty that this man had stolen $40 million, sabotaged the most important project her company had ever built, and driven her father to his death, and yet he would not bend. In the flash of rage that followed, with cameras rolling and journalists watching from every angle, she slapped him across the face in full view of the federal courthouse steps. Nolan did not raise a hand or raise his voice. He simply looked at her and said that she had just done exactly what the person behind all of this had been hoping for. Grant Hargrove, her chief legal counsel, bent to retrieve the agreement from the marble floor, glanced at the document code printed in the lower corner of the final page, and felt the blood drain from his face. He leaned close to Vivian's ear and told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, that they had charged the wrong man. Stay with this until the end to learn who turned an innocent man into a criminal and a CEO into a puppet. The trial of Nolan Reed had drawn more press than most federal proceedings in Chicago that year, and the reason was straightforward: $40 million, a classified aviation system, and a company whose name appeared on the guidance controls of nearly every commercial aircraft built in the country over the previous 2 decades. Ashford Aeronautics had filed 3 charges against its former systems auditor: misappropriation of company assets, theft of classified aeronautical data, and deliberate sabotage of the Aquila 1 flight control prototype that was meant to be the company's defining achievement for the next generation of autonomous aviation. The prosecution had offered Nolan a reduced sentence in exchange for a signed admission and the surrender of what they described as a final copy of stolen data, and his own defense attorney, Rachel Monroe, had spent 2 private meetings urging him to weigh the offer seriously, because the evidence arrayed against him was not merely strong, but appeared to be airtight. Nolan had listened to Rachel's counsel with the patience of someone who had already made his decision long before anyone had thought to ask him, and each time he declined, he offered no elaborate explanation, only the statement that he could not confess to something he had not done. On the morning the trial was scheduled to begin, Vivian Ashford had positioned herself in the corridor outside the main chamber with the signed agreement ready, flanked by 2 members of her legal team and certain in the belief that one final conversation might accomplish what months of court proceedings had not. She placed the document on the window ledge between them and told Nolan that signing it would not be an admission of guilt so much as a practical decision. A way to protect his daughter, protect what remained of his finances, and bring a conclusion to something that had already cost everyone involved far more than it was worth. Nolan glanced at the paper without touching it, and then he said that he could not confess to something he had not done, that the words had not changed and would not change no matter how many times the offer was reframed. Vivian brought up her father then because Charles Ashford had suffered a stroke in his final months, and the timeline of that collapse overlapped precisely with the period when the company's internal investigators had first confirmed that $40 million was missing from the Aquila 1 development budget, and she had believed for a long time that the shock of the betrayal was what had broken him. Nolan's reply was quiet and direct. Charles had known he was innocent. Vivian told him that invoking her father's name to shield himself was the lowest thing a person could do, and in the moment that followed, a moment she would spend years trying to understand, she struck him across the face with an open hand, hard enough that several reporters at the far end of the corridor turned to look. Nolan absorbed it without moving back, without changing his expression, And then he told her that she had just done exactly what the person behind all of this had been hoping for. Grant Hargrove stepped forward to collect the agreement, which had fallen face down onto the floor. And when he turned it over and read the document identification code printed at the bottom of the final page, he felt something shift in his understanding of the entire case. The timestamp embedded in that code told him the agreement had been generated on the company's finance division server 3 days before the prosecution had formally requested that such a document be drafted. There was only one person at Ashford Aeronautics with the administrative authority to create documents at that classification level without a direct executive order. That person was Silas Blackwell. Grant leaned close enough to Vivian to be heard only by her, and he told her they had charged the wrong man. And then the courtroom doors swung open, and the bailiff announced that the judge was ready, and all parties were required to take their positions. The prosecution's opening presentation to the jury was methodical and convincing in the way that only a case built from many layers of documentation can be, and the lead attorney walked the panel through 6 months of financial transfers that had moved $40 million out of the Aquila One development budget in irregular installments, each routed through 3 component suppliers whose paperwork was impeccable until you looked for the physical infrastructure behind them and found nothing. Every single transaction in that chain carried Nolan Reed's authorization code. The company's security logs showed his account accessing restricted servers during overnight hours on 14 separate occasions, and on each of those nights, significant quantities of proprietary design data had been moved to an external location. A corridor camera had captured footage of a figure in a jacket matching the one Nolan habitually wore entering the secure server room during the period in question, though the angle of the lens had not captured a face. The prosecution framed Nolan as an employee who had grown quietly bitter after years of watching others advance while he remained in a supporting role, a man whose financial pressures had deepened during the long illness of his wife, and who had ultimately chosen to use his privileged access to the company's most sensitive systems as a means of personal enrichment. Vivienne sat on the prosecution side of the gallery and kept her expression composed, though Grant's words from the corridor had lodged themselves in her attention and were refusing to stay quiet. She found herself looking at each piece of evidence not as confirmation of what she already believed, but as something that could theoretically be interpreted another way, and the experience was deeply uncomfortable. Grant, seated beside her, was running a parallel line of analysis on his own tablet, tracing the metadata of the documents the prosecution was citing, checking the server logs against the administrative access records he had requested that morning, and finding that the first technical report naming Nolan as the primary suspect had been opened using Silas Blackwell's administrator credentials 2 days before it was formally submitted to the legal team. When Grant raised this with Silas during the morning recess, Silas responded without hesitation that shared systems were a routine feature of the company's infrastructure and that Grant was constructing an argument out of nothing more than coincidence. Rachel Monroe's cross-examination of the prosecution's first witness identified a structural problem at the center of the case, and she pressed on it with the kind of patience that suggested she had been waiting for exactly the right moment. Nolan held read-level access to the Aquila One data, she established. He could view records, flag anomalies, and generate internal reports. But he had no authority to independently approve financial transfers above a certain threshold, and the transfers in question were each well above that limit. To have moved $40 million through the company's systems, he would have required the active cooperation of at least one senior executive with approval authority, and no such cooperation had been documented or alleged. The prosecutor suggested that Nolan might have obtained Charles Ashford's authentication credentials by deception and used them without the founder's knowledge. Nolan sat at the defense table and said nothing, though Rachel noticed that his jaw tightened slightly when Charles's name was attached to the suggestion, and she filed that reaction away. The afternoon session introduced an audio recording into evidence, played through the courtroom speakers at moderate volume, in which a voice that the prosecution identified as Nolan's stated that once Ashford was gone, there would be nothing left to stop them. The recording settled over the room like a weight, and several members of the jury shifted in their seats, and Vivian closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them again and looked at Nolan's face, which had gone still in a way that was hard to read. Rachel filed an immediate request for independent acoustic analysis, and over the following 48 hours, an expert unaffiliated with either side examined the recording and returned a preliminary finding that while the voice characteristics were consistent with Nolan's, the file contained microscopic splice points. Evidence of editing so precise that it would require both professional equipment and a substantial library of the subject's original voice to execute convincingly. Nolan explained to Rachel during a recess that he had spent several years producing internal training videos for the company's technical staff, hundreds of hours of recorded instruction that had been archived on Ashford's secure servers, and that any person with access to those archives and the right software would have had everything they needed to reconstruct a plausible version of his voice, saying things he had never said. The prosecutor called this a speculative defense. In the corridor outside the courtroom during the midday break, Grant sat with Vivian and walked her through what he had found, and the pattern he described was precise enough to be disturbing. Every piece of evidence pointed directly and cleanly at Nolan. The camera had captured a figure but not a face. The audio contained exactly the phrases most likely to generate emotional conviction in a jury, and the confession agreement had been prepared before it was technically possible for the prosecution to have requested it. Grant told her that evidence which assembles itself this neatly is usually assembled by someone. He told her that the person who had guided her through every stage of her grief over her father's death and helped her hold the company together in the aftermath was also the only person who had possessed the access and the organizational knowledge to construct this. Vivian told him that she would not believe that without proof. Grant said he understood, and that was why they needed to find it. The prosecution had made its position clear. Nolan Reed was a man with motive, means, and a documented pattern of suspicious behavior, and the offer of a reduced sentence remained on the table if he chose to accept responsibility before the jury reached its deliberations. Rachel asked Nolan privately to explain why he continued to refuse an agreement that would substantially reduce his exposure, and he told her about the clause buried in the final paragraph of the document, a standard-looking provision that required him to surrender all copies of any data in his possession related to the Aquila 1 project, with that data to be transferred to Ashford Aeronautics and sealed under a confidentiality order that would prevent its contents from ever being disclosed in any proceeding. He was not simply being asked to plead guilty, he told her. He was being asked to hand the only evidence of what had actually happened directly to the people who had manufactured the charges against him and ensure that it could never be used. Charles Ashford had given Nolan a small encrypted storage device in the weeks before his health collapsed, and on that device were the original payment records, the Aquila 1 technical assessments in their unmodified form, a ledger of the shell company transactions, an audio file from a private board meeting, and documentation showing that money had been systematically withdrawn from the company by someone with executive-level authority. The device required 2 separate cryptographic keys to open, and Nolan held one of them. The second key belonged to someone he had not named, because naming that person in open court would alert Silas immediately, and give him time to destroy whatever remained of the evidence before it could be secured. Rachel sat with this information and understood that Nolan's silence was not self-protection but witness protection. He was keeping a second person legally alive in a case where the opposition had already demonstrated it could reach inside the company's document infrastructure. Paige Reed waited for her father in the holding area adjacent to the main corridor during one of the longer recesses. And when they sat together, she asked him the question she had been holding back since the trial began, which was why he would not simply take the agreement and come home. Nolan looked at her for a long moment and then told her that if he signed that document, he might come home sooner. But the person who came home would not be the father who had taught her that telling the truth was not a calculation you made based on the consequences. It was a decision you made once, and then kept making every day regardless of the cost. Paige did not argue with him, and Nolan did not elaborate, and they sat in silence for a while before she was asked to return to the public gallery. That evening, Vivienne went back to the company's executive archives under the pretext of retrieving documents for the legal team, and she pulled her father's calendar from the final quarter of his life. What she found contradicted something Silas had told her in the weeks following Charles's death. Silas had described Nolan as someone Charles had grown to distrust and had been planning to dismiss. But the calendar showed 3 meetings between Charles and Nolan in the month before his stroke, 2 in the main office, and 1 at the private testing airfield the company maintained outside the city. None of them logged in the official scheduling system, and none of them listed in the summaries Silas had provided to the board. In her father's desk drawer, tucked beneath a leather organizer, she found a piece of notepaper in Charles's handwriting. It said that NR was not the thief, and it told her to check the 4th floor. Vivienne stood in her father's office for a long time with that note in her hand, because Ashford Aeronautics had 3 official financial floors and no 4th. Grant remembered immediately when Vivienne showed him the note. The 4th floor was the name the company's old internal compliance team had used, years before his time, for a shadow ledger system that Charles had built to monitor transactions that the finance division was not reporting through normal channels. It was not a physical location, but a data layer, a secondary accounting system nested behind the primary records, accessible only through a specific administrative path that had been active since the earliest years of the company. Vivienne and Grant accessed it together late that night, from a terminal in a storage room that still ran on older software, and what they found inside was a precise and damning record of the movement of company money over the previous 3 years. There were dozens of transfers routed to 3 entities: Blackridge Components, North Vale Aviation, and Crown Meridian Logistics. All 3 were registered at the same commercial address in a suburb of Indianapolis. None of them had a manufacturing facility or a workforce. Every transfer carried a final approval signature linked to Charles Ashford's executive credentials, and Vivienne's first instinct was a cold and nauseating one, that her father had been a participant in the theft rather than its victim. Grant examined the timestamps more carefully and then told her to look at the dates on the approvals. Every one of them had been authorized after the day Charles was admitted to the hospital, after the morning he had lost the ability to use a keyboard or issue instructions, or be present in any building in which decisions were made. Someone had continued to use his credentials, his authentication tokens, and his digital signature after he had ceased to be capable of granting permission for any of it. The only person who had been given control of Charles's security devices during his hospitalization, as a formal delegation recorded in the company's administrative log, was Silas Blackwell. Grant recommended that Vivienne pass the data to Rachel without disclosing the source to the court before they were ready, and Vivienne hesitated because doing so would expose internal company records in a proceeding where Ashford Aeronautics was the complaining party, and the legal exposure to shareholders would be significant. Grant asked her whether she intended to protect Ashford Aeronautics, or protect the person who was currently wearing the company's name like a disguise. She copied a portion of the archive to a personal drive and delivered it to Rachel the following morning. Rachel used the new records to challenge the prosecution's financial expert during the next session, walking him through the transaction structure and asking him to identify the originating machine for each transfer. The expert, who had clearly not expected the defense to possess internal server logs, acknowledged under pressure that the transactions had not originated from Nolan's personal workstation, but from the company's central administrative server, and that Nolan's authorization code appeared to have been appended to each record after the transaction was already complete, not embedded in the transaction itself as it would have been if he had initiated it. Silas recognized what was happening. He called an emergency session of the board and moved to suspend Vivian's executive authority on the grounds that her involvement in providing materials to the defense constituted a conflict of interest and a breach of fiduciary duty. He also circulated a suggestion among board members that Vivian's unusual interest in the case reflected a personal attachment to the defendant, a claim that had no factual basis but was calibrated precisely to undermine both her credibility and the evidentiary weight of whatever she had shared. The board voted to remove her from the CEO role provisionally while the trial continued, and Vivian learned about the decision from Grant's phone call rather than from any official notification, because her access to company systems had already been revoked by the time the vote concluded. Vivian found herself locked out of every system she had spent 4 years building, her security badge disabled, her company vehicle returned, and her executive access codes deactivated before she had a chance to retrieve half the documents she needed. She carried what she had managed to copy and sat across from Nolan in a conference room that Rachel had arranged, and he did not offer her sympathy or observation on the irony of the situation. Instead, he said something that landed more heavily than she had expected, that she had not lost her power the day the board voted, but had given it away incrementally over years, by extending unconditional trust to a person who had understood from the beginning that her grief over her father made her vulnerable to exactly that kind of manipulation. Vivian apologized for the incident in the corridor, and she did it plainly, without framing it as a misunderstanding or attributing it to stress, because she had spent the previous 2 days understanding that what she had done was not ambiguous. Nolan said that an apology carried weight only if she was willing to correct the public account of what had happened, because the version that had been broadcast from the courthouse steps had become part of how people understood his guilt. She said she would issue a statement, and Grant advised her that doing so would expose the company to civil liability from shareholders who had relied on its public representations about the strength of its case, and she issued the statement anyway. The press reported her announcement with a skepticism that was partly editorial and partly earned, because the admission that the company had potentially presented flawed evidence came from a CEO who no longer technically held that title, and Silas moved quickly to fill the narrative vacuum with the email that Nolan had sent to Charles in the final months of the project, an email in which Nolan had written, in direct and unambiguous language, that if Charles did not halt the Aquila 1 launch timeline, he would ensure that the entire company knew the truth about the system's condition. Nolan confirmed the email was genuine when Rachel asked him about it in open court, and he explained what it meant without defending it as diplomatic. The Aquila 1 flight control system had a critical flaw in its response algorithm that caused it to misinterpret its own positioning data when satellite signal strength dropped below a certain threshold. and in practical terms that meant the aircraft could take a corrective action that was precisely the wrong one during the kind of weather event that created partial GPS degradation, and nobody who was seated on the aircraft it was controlling would survive the result. Charles had known about the flaw. He had chosen to delay disclosure because the company's launch contracts were tied to a delivery date, and the financial consequences of missing that date were severe enough that he had convinced himself there was time to fix the issue quietly after the contracts were signed and before the system went into active deployment. Nolan had argued with him about it, forcefully and at length, and the email was a document of that argument rather than a threat in the sense the prosecution had implied. Eventually, Charles had agreed to authorize a full investigation rather than a controlled patch, which was the decision that had put Nolan inside the restricted data systems and given Silas the access pattern he needed to build the frame. Vivian absorbed this account of her father without visible collapse, but something fundamental shifted in her understanding of him. He was not simply the founder who had been betrayed by a trusted employee and broken by the discovery, but a man who had made a serious choice in the direction of his own interests before making the harder one. And both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither of them canceled the other. Nolan brought her to the private airfield that evening, and in the inspection bay that had been used for Aquila 1's earliest test phases, they searched for the second key, which Charles had described in a brief handwritten note as stored in the equipment cabinet at the far wall. The cabinet was empty. The lock had been opened within the last several months, based on the dust pattern around the mechanism. A dormant security camera in the corner of the bay, which had been overlooked rather than disabled, had recorded whoever had opened that cabinet, and when Grant retrieved the footage and played it back, the figure on the screen was not Silas Blackwell. It was Grant Hargrove. Vivian confronted him that night, and he did not attempt to deny it. Charles had given him the second key in person during one of his final coherent days in the hospital, and he had given it with a specific instruction. The data was to be opened only when both Nolan and Vivian were prepared to accept full public disclosure of everything on the device, including the evidence of Charles's own initial reluctance and complicity in concealing the design flaw. Charles had known that neither Nolan nor Vivian would be capable of burying the truth on their own, but he had also known that grief and pride might lead either of them to hold something back if given sole control of the narrative. And so he had divided the evidence between two people who had no reason to trust each other, knowing that the only way to open it was to agree on transparency. Grant had not known Nolan held the first key. Nolan had not known Charles had chosen Grant for the second. The three of them sat together in a law office that Rachel had made available after hours, and they placed both keys into the system simultaneously, and the encrypted drive opened. The audio recording from the board meeting was the most significant item inside it. Silas could be heard in that recording acknowledging that the shell companies had been used to extract funds from the project, and he told Charles directly that the arrangement had benefited both of them through the inflation of the project's reported value, and Charles told him it was over and the money had to be returned, and Silas told Charles that if the truth came out, they would both be destroyed. The recording did not contain explicit instructions from Silas to frame Nolan. That link came from the final file in the drive, a list of system access codes that identified who had used Charles's credentials after his hospitalization. The code belonged to Elliot Vance, who had served as Silas's senior financial assistant for 11 years, and who had disappeared from the company within 48 hours of Nolan's arrest. Rachel filed a motion requesting that Elliot Vance be subpoenaed and brought before the court, and the prosecution informed the judge that locating him had proven difficult because he was residing under a different name and had made arrangements consistent with someone preparing to leave the country. Grant located him through a provision in the company's confidentiality agreements that required former employees in senior financial roles to maintain a registered domestic account for a period of 7 years following their departure, and a cross-reference against the payment records from Blackridge Components showed that Elliott was still receiving a monthly transfer from the shell company, which was still, technically, active, using an account that could be traced to his registered identity. Federal investigators reached him before he completed his travel arrangements. When Elliott Vance was brought before the court under a negotiated protection arrangement, he provided a detailed account of what Silas had directed him to do over a period of approximately 8 months. He had duplicated Nolan's access credentials using a security tool that Silas had obtained without logging it in the company's software inventory. He had used Charles's authentication tokens during the hospitalization period to authorize the fraudulent transfers. He had created the shell companies using incorporation services in 3 different states. He had assembled the audio recording of Nolan's voice from the training archive, using software that Silas had specified and that Elliott had run on an air-gapped machine in a rented office space with no network connection. He had adjusted the corridor camera angle in the weeks before the relevant footage was captured. He had placed a copy of the proprietary design files in a directory on Nolan's work machine during a period when Nolan had been called to an off-site meeting that Silas had personally arranged. In exchange, Elliott had been promised $1 million and a position at a subsidiary of a foreign holding company. He had taken the precaution of recording Silas's instructions on a personal device because he had understood from the beginning of the arrangement that Silas would eventually need a person to absorb the consequences if the plan encountered complications. The device Elliott produced contained Silas's voice giving instructions in specific operational language, and in one section of the recording, Silas described why Nolan Reed had been selected as the subject of the frame with a precision that was almost clinical. Nolan was the one person inside the company who had discovered the actual financial irregularities on his own. Nolan was carrying the financial weight of a family situation that made him plausible as someone in need of money. Nolan had no executive relationships that would make powerful people unwilling to believe the worst of him. Nolan had documented friction with Charles over the Aquila One timeline, which gave the narrative an emotional logic, and Nolan had enough system access to make the story technically coherent without requiring Silas to manufacture the access itself. All that was necessary was to attach Nolan's credentials to actions Nolan had never taken. Silas's voice in the recording also addressed the question of Vivienne's emotional state. He had made certain that her grief over her father was directed at Nolan, specifically by shaping the information she received in the months following Charles's death, ensuring she understood the stroke as a consequence of the betrayal rather than as the consequence of the confrontation between Charles and Silas over the missing money, which was what it actually was. Charles had collapsed during a meeting in which he had told Silas that the arrangement was finished and that he intended to cooperate with an external audit regardless of the personal cost, and Silas had responded in a manner that had placed enough stress on the founder's already compromised cardiovascular system to end the conversation permanently. The prosecutor, who had built an entire case on a manufactured evidentiary chain, approached the bench after the device was played in full and told the judge that the integrity of the case against Nolan Reed had been fundamentally compromised and that the state was not in a position to continue the prosecution. The judge dismissed all charges and directed that Nolan be released immediately and ordered the complete file transferred to the Federal Investigative Division for criminal proceedings against Silas Blackwell and Elliott Vance. Silas rose from his seat in the gallery, and the court officer moved to intercept him before he reached the door, and there was no scene, no confrontation, no physical resistance. Only a man in an expensive suit being guided back to a chair by someone younger and less complicated, his entire architecture of control dismantled not by force but by the paper trail he had believed he owned. Before the judge closed the session, Nolan asked to address the court one final time regarding Charles Ashford, and the judge allowed it. He did not construct a monument. He told the court that Charles Ashford had known the Aquila 1 system was not ready for deployment and had hesitated to say so publicly because the financial and reputational cost of honesty had seemed, for a period of months, to be more than the company could survive. That was the first version of Charles. The second version was the man who had eventually chosen to authorize a real investigation regardless of what it cost him, who had begun quietly assembling evidence against the people exploiting the vulnerabilities he himself had created, and who had divided that evidence between two people who would be forced by the structure of his arrangement to work together and tell the whole truth rather than a curated portion of it. Charles had left a recording, and Nolan played it before the court in its original, unedited form. In it, Charles said that if his daughter ever heard what he was about to say, someone should tell her that protecting the Ashford name was not worth as much as making it worth protecting. Vivienne did not leave the room. She sat in the gallery and did not look away, and when the recording ended she was crying. But she stayed in her seat until the last procedural formality had been completed and the room had begun to empty. She faced the cameras outside the courthouse and gave a statement in which she acknowledged that her company had submitted evidence it should have examined more carefully, that she had publicly condemned a man before the facts had been established, that she had struck that man in front of witnesses in a moment that she would not characterize as anything other than her own failure, and that the loss of her executive position did not constitute a transfer of her personal responsibility for what she had said and done. She told the press that she was sorry, with Nolan standing 20 feet away and the same cameras that had filmed the slap now filming the apology. Nolan did not offer immediate forgiveness, because he understood that forgiveness given immediately and unconditionally was sometimes less honest than the version that waited for evidence. He told her that trust was not something that could be restored in a single press event, and that he meant that not as a rebuke but as a description of how the process actually worked. Vivienne accepted that without argument. She and Grant moved within the following days to transfer the complete contents of the fourth-floor archive to the Federal Aviation Regulatory Authority and formally requested that the Aquila 1 project be placed under an independent technical review with no participation from Ashford Aeronautics in the oversight structure. The board, faced with a situation in which their provisional acting leadership was under federal investigation and the records of the company's financial conduct were in the hands of regulators, voted unanimously to reverse the suspension and reinstate Vivienne to the CEO position. She accepted the reinstatement with a condition that was not negotiable. An independent safety board would be established with the authority to halt any project at any stage without requiring executive approval, and its members would serve fixed terms that could not be shortened by the board or the chief executive. 1 year after the charges against him were dismissed, Nolan accepted a role as director of the Charles Ashford Aviation Safety Foundation, an independent nonprofit with no organizational relationship to Ashford Aeronautics beyond the shared name on its charter. He did not return to his former position inside the company because he had understood during the months of the trial that the work he was suited for was the work that sat outside the structure, where the pressure to protect institutional interests could not be used to redirect what honesty required. The foundation operated from a modest office 2 blocks from the federal courthouse, staffed by engineers and investigators who had each left corporate roles for the same reason Nolan had stayed outside them. Because the work of finding problems was structurally different from the work of managing the appearance of having found them, and those two missions could not permanently share the same address without one eventually distorting the other. Nolan's first report as director identified 3 disclosure protocols in domestic aviation regulation where the financial incentive to delay public notification was structurally larger than the incentive to issue it promptly, and he submitted the report without advance notice to any company named in it, because that was precisely the point of doing the work from the outside. The Aquila 1 project returned to testing only after every flaw in the control algorithm had been publicly documented, corrected, and verified by an external technical panel whose findings were posted in full on the regulatory authority's public database. Vivienne ran the company differently than she had before, not dramatically or performatively, but in the specific way that people change when the version of reality they had organized their lives around turns out to have been carefully constructed by someone who benefited from their certainty. Every safety flag that came up in development now had the automatic authority to pause a project, and the engineers who raised them were protected by a process that did not route through the executive suite before taking effect. Paige Reed completed her first year at university and spent the following summer working at a nonprofit organization in the Midwest that had nothing to do with aviation or with Ashford Aeronautics, because she had told her father early in the spring semester that she wanted at least one chapter of her life that was entirely her own before anyone had the opportunity to attach a headline to it. The relationship between Nolan and Vivienne grew the way things grow when they are not forced, slowly, through the accumulation of ordinary contact that had nothing to do with trials or boards or legal strategy, contact that started in shared meetings and gradually moved into the space where professional obligation ended and voluntary presence began. They met through the overlapping work of the foundation and the company, and then they met outside of that work for meals at restaurants where nobody recognized either of them, where there were no attorneys and no journalists and no governance structures to navigate. In the last scene that the story allows itself, Vivienne brought Nolan a new safety report, a thick document produced by the independent board she had helped create, and she asked him whether he believed she had changed. He looked at the report for a moment, and then he told her that he believed what she did when no one required it of her, and that what the report in his hands represented was evidence of exactly that. Vivienne looked across the street to the federal courthouse, to the corridor outside the main chamber, where she had pressed a confession document into his hands, and then, when he refused it, had struck him in front of everyone. She said that on that morning she had wanted him to confess to a lie because telling the truth herself was more than she had been willing to face. Nolan closed the report and set it on the table and said that she should never ask anyone to do that again. They walked into the meeting together, not as accuser and accused, not as the CEO and the auditor, not as the woman who had slapped and the man who had absorbed it, but as two people who had chosen what was true over what was convenient, in a corridor where a confession form had fallen to the floor and a lawyer had read a timestamp, and the whole careful architecture of a lie had begun, at last, to fall apart.